Hello,
Hello.
namaste. Welcome to Speaking Craft with Khem, a podcast about literary heritage, influences, and innovations. I'm Khem K, Aryal, a writer and editor. In this podcast, I talk with authors featured in my forthcoming anthology, Migrating Craft, set to be released in 2026. My guest for this second episode is Joanna Eleftheriou, the author of the book of essays This Way Back, a contributing editor of Essay, a journal of nonfiction studies, and a faculty member at the writing workshops in Greece. Joanna Eleftheriou is an associate professor at Christopher Newport University.
Hello,
Hi,
Khem.
Joanna.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. But even before that, I
Yep.
hope I pronounced your last name
hmm
correctly. I did? Okay, great. Yeah, great to have you, of course, especially this time of the semester. You just said that, before we started recording, your semester just ended, but I believe there are papers to grade and
Yep.
everything. So thank you so much. It's really exciting. It feels really good to be speaking about craft
Such
with
a great
you.
opportunity to connect with other writers with different backgrounds.
Yeah, definitely. So let me start with this pretty general information about yourself. You were born in New York, right? But you grew up in Cyprus as well, and you actually continue to return to Greece,
Yep.
Cyprus almost every year. That's what
Yep.
I understand. So it looks like you are living in two worlds
Right.
simultaneously. So could you share what it's like, or it was like, to grow up in two places, or to be living in two different
Yeah, it
places?
was quite a culture shock when my father just kind of got homesick, is the way we talk about the reason why we left the United States and became immigrants from the United States to Cyprus, where my father was born. When you invited me to
Right.
Migrating Craft, mentioned that I'm not an immigrant to the United States. I was born in New York City, but I became an
Right.
immigrant to somewhere else. And it was quite shocking because I had studied the Greek language in elementary school, but like most American kids studying a foreign language, I really didn't master the language. So it was a real struggle to be in a Greek speaking environment and experience culture shock, which obviously I didn't have a name for at the age of 10. But when I took an anthropology course in undergrad, I really related. And it was almost 10 years later that I had a name for what I experienced. Going to a place that maybe shouldn't have been foreign because I grew up in a Greek community. I never went to public school in America. I only went to Greek parochial schools. My parents met at a Greek American school,
Right.
but I was still very culture shocked when I moved to a Greek speaking country of Cyprus.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? So you're talking about being an immigrant in a country where your
Right.
father was
Yes.
born. And of course, it has had consequences. Can you tell us briefly about how moving between these two places shaped you maybe linguistically, not just of course culturally, right? That's always there, but you said you also started learning Greek at a
Yes.
very young age here in New
Yes.
York itself, and you went back and maybe you learned more there, and you also started teaching
I
English as
did.
a second language in Greece. How did those things shape you, maybe here linguistically and creatively, if
Yes.
that makes any
One
sense?
thing that I think I notice myself doing that maybe somebody who doesn't speak two languages as comfortably as I do is I'm constantly asking myself, would this happen in the other language? So when a conversation is happening in English, I sometimes like sort of ask myself, is this possible in Greek? How would I translate this into Greek? And
Hmm.
vice versa, in a Greek speaking conversation, I find myself like, part of me is like translating it into English, almost like so my English brain can understand what's happening.
Right.
And then I get curious. I think I find myself getting really curious when something is untranslatable, and I get excited and look for the ways that I experience the world differently because a word is untranslatable, because obviously the what's curious is then, okay, if you can't translate a word, or you know that a given action will elicit a different response in a different language, that leads to me inevitably asking why.
Right. Yeah. Especially the issue of translation when it comes to working
Yes.
in two different languages, right? That always becomes very tricky. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're
Yeah, it
adding
brings up
something
the
there?
question of audience, because
Mm-hmm.
different English speaking audiences tend to expect everything to be sort of accessible to them. I even noticed like sometimes in the early days of social media, if I would post things in Greek, people would like English speakers, even like it was actually professors of my old professors of mine would
Mm-hmm.
like comment and complain that they couldn't understand. Actually, before social media started automatically translating things, um, people would come, English
Right.
speakers would complain because they couldn't read what I posted in Greek. And similarly, in my writing, if I have something in Greek, I find that English only speakers have this entitlement to understand everything, to have the whole world available to them. Whereas I haven't encountered that. Obviously, I'm only fluent in one other language, Greek, and that's just not something that happens with Greek Cypriots, because they expect a lot of the world to be unavailable to them in Greek. They expect that a lot of the world will be happening in
Mm.
other languages, whereas um, English speakers tend to expect everything to be available to them. And now that social media auto translates, sometimes when I want, it's weird, like I don't have the right to post something only in Greek, and I sometimes like take a screenshot of something in Greek and then post it as a photo, because I want the ability to just say something in Greek and for it not to be translated by a robot.
Right. Yeah, again, when it's the robot that translates, then those translations are not always accurate, especially maybe when it comes to languages like my Nepali. Sometimes it's really, really weird. We cannot
Or I
just
got accused of
rely on
being
them, obviously.
racist once because I was having a conversation in
Right.
Greek,
Yeah, that's very
and
possible.
the robot translated it, and
Hmm.
somebody who doesn't know Greek read the translation and didn't have any nuance and felt entitled to make accusations based on a translation that I did not produce or realize was being produced.
Right. Right. So that's why I'm always scared of those things when uh, social media actually starts translating my Nepali into English. Anyway, those issues are really interesting issues. We could probably talk about translation uh, some other time. Let me get to another issue. Um, you seem to be really deeply attached to the idea of
Yeah.
Ithaca. So you went to school in Ithaca, Cornell, and you have described your father's return to Cyprus as actually his
Mm-hmm.
audition journey to his own
Mm-hmm.
Ithacas, right? And actually, you have that essay
Mm-hmm.
called Ithacas. And actually, you've also written that longing for an Ithaca from the distance of Calypso's island still moves Greeks to sing. So I found that really, really interesting. It's, I mean, on
Yes.
different levels, right? Ithacas on different levels. So would you say your writing too is kind of song for
Yes,
Ithaca?
and I find it a really perfect metaphor that works, as you said, on multiple levels because it is something that is specifically Greek. It just by chance that I did go to university in a town named Ithaca, but it's what's not a coincidence is that I went to university in America because I'm an American citizen and I'm a first language English speaker. Why? Because of the global colonization of Britain and Anglo-American culture, right? So it feel like on the one hand it's a coincidence that I went to a town called Ithaca for university, but on the other hand it's not a coincidence because I am a Greek person who speaks English. Why do I speak English? Because of the global dominance and colonization of the world by Anglo-American culture. My father was born a British subject. His first passport says British subject on it
Oh, okay.
because Cyprus was a colony of
Mhm.
Britain from 1878 when
Right.
the Ottoman Empire had to give up Cyprus because of debt. The Ottoman Empire was indebted
Oh,
and falling apart. So debt
okay.
colonization, financial colonization, it feels maybe like part of the neoliberal world, but it was happening back
Mhm.
in as the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. My father was born into a British place because his grandparents were born into an Ottoman place, but then the Ottomans were financially ruined.
Right.
So I was, yes, born
Right.
into an English speaking world, and I went to college in Ithaca because the Americans and British consider Greece the cradle of their civilization. So I very much feel like Anglo-American culture has appropriated Greek culture and considers it their right to just name places after Greek places as if they are the
Right. Yeah.
heirs of Greek civilization, not me, who I am Greek. I'm Greek and descended from people who are born in that area.
Right.
Very similar, I think, to the appropriation of Namaste and maybe a lot of
That's true.
your culture has been appropriated by Anglo Americans as well.
Yeah.
The that experience shaped my writing, but then writing about it shaped my experience. And what I have that my father didn't have is writing. My father just had this sense of wanting to go back, I think, to a time. And I think this is the aspect of the Ithaca longing that is universal. A lot of people feel like there must be a time when things were easier, more peaceful, a time when they felt at peace, when they felt more connected to themselves and other people, to the world. And I think that that might be what even the parable of Adam and Eve and the garden, and in other religions and cultures, there is an imagined past where things were peaceful and people were connected. I think that my father had that longing for a time when he felt more at peace,
Mhm.
and he didn't have the experience of writing about it to realize that. He just was almost,
Right.
he made it literal and he just kept going to the other place where
Mhm.
he used to be.
Nice.
And I had the luxury of writing about it to kind of come to terms with the reality that I think is it's an illusion to think there's a place we can go to where we will be at peace. And through writing, I
Right.
accepted that that's an illusion.
Right. Right. And you can understand that betrayal of
Yes,
nostalgia,
precisely.
something that you also discussed. Another question I have is kind of going back to what you were talking about a minute ago, and this question may also uh, be like kind of high sounding, but still I wanted to kind of talk about this briefly. So critics have pointed out, as we can see, actually, up until the mid 19th century, much of Western literature was produced by writers who were deeply familiar or deeply in love with
Yep.
the Greek tradition, right? So, as a writer with that heritage, right, Greek heritage, how does it feel to be part of that enduring
That's the
tradition?
question at the foundation. Yeah,
Or, I mean, I feel like, do you ever feel that weight of the
I don't,
canons
but
kind
the
of thing, right?
feeling of that weight
Hmm.
is kind of the foundation of modern Greek studies. I was lucky enough to do a year during my English undergrad. I did 1 year of modern Greek studies and I studied modern Greek. So from Byzantine times and
Okay.
later, Greek literature and
Okay.
history. And that was the focus of so much Greek literature.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because, again, as I said, it could be kind of high sounding stuff, a little preposterous to look at things this way. But still, oh yeah, that's
Right.
my past, right? My place is
Yes.
past, my ancestors past.
I think it's important
And
to
so,
remember that modern Greek writers were also experiencing a Western gaze. So they're imagining
mhm.
themselves as the almost like failed children of the ancient Greeks, not because of a domestic
Okay.
memory of ancient Greece, but because while Greek culture, let's say, was somewhat stagnant because there wasn't a lot of publishing that could go on while the Greek lands, Greek speaking places were ruled by the Sultan.
Mhm.
That time, so
Right.
the 1400s until the early 1800s, that period was the Western Renaissance. So while the West was discovering or rediscovering ancient Greece, the Greek speaking people were unable to produce much literature and civilization because they were not ruling themselves and they didn't have institutions and things because they were ruled by the Ottoman Sultan. So after the Greeks,
What an
yes,
irony,
but
right?
then
Hmm.
during the Western Renaissance, all of this sort of appropriation of ancient Greece and imagining ancient Greece as the cradle of German, English, French civilization happened. So then the Northwestern Europeans come back to Greece and say, like, what are you doing? Why aren't you as good as your parents? So that's why Greek writers in the 19th and 20th century feel under that shadow. Not, I would argue, not because of an a domestic memory of their antiquity, but of a reflection back to them by the West who says, "Oh, we've decided that you don't measure up to these ancient Greeks."
Right. Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, now let's get to more modern
Yes.
times, modern Greek literature. Again, it's not that I know, but but you've said actually you've discussed Gaddafi's influence on you in one of
Hmm.
your essays, I guess, and noting that see the poem, his poem, the first
Yeah.
step gave you a lasting insight into the problem
Yeah.
of making art. So could you
Yeah, I
unpack that a
was
little
in
bit?
ninth grade when I studied this, one of the greatest poets writing in modern Greek ever. He was born in the late 19th century, and so it's kind of that Victorian to modernism shift. He's modernist, really. And so his language is accessible to me in ways that obviously is Greek from 2,500 years ago. None of us know English from 2,500 years ago. So I don't know Greek from 2,500 years ago, but I
Mhm.
do understand Greek from 100 years ago, just like I understand English from 100 years ago. This is something that I have to constantly explain. So I can understand English from 100 years ago and I understand Greek from 100 years ago. And when I was 14, in my first time taking Greek with the other native speakers, which was a big challenge for me, I very gradually got up to par with native speakers of Greek. And we read this poem, and this master of irony, Cavafy, has a more experienced poet telling a naive young poet who is disappointed that he hasn't made progress with leaps and bounds in all his struggles. He says, if you got to the first step of writing, of literature, of poetry, this is huge. You shouldn't have the hubris of expecting to have accomplished a lot right away. So yeah, that was my introduction to an understanding of how difficult accomplishing anything in art is, and how we should always be grateful and proud of any small progress we're able to make.
Right. I hadn't read that poem before, but I was curious, and I read it. It's great, and I have a feeling that actually we should share it if you have it handy.
I
Do you have the
don't, but
poem
I
with
think
you?
I can.
Yeah, you can pull up, I think, pretty quickly. Or I mean, you can take
Yeah,
your
we can
time. I
talk
can.
about. So I pulled it up
We can.
in Greek, and I will also pull it up in English. Oh, it's very, as anybody who is watching and also Googles The First Step by Gavafi will see, it is very widely available, and there's many, many different translations.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, do you mind going
yeah.
ahead and reading it out loud?
I can't, I'm trying to see who is. This is translated by Edmund Keeley and Philip Sherrard in 1975. The First Step. The young poet Evmenis complained one day to Theokritos, I have been writing for 2 years now, and I have composed just one idyll. It's my only completed work. I see, sadly, that the ladder of poetry is tall, extremely tall, and from this step I now stand on, I will never climb any higher. Theokritos replied, words like that are improper, blasphemous. Just to be on the first step should make you happy and proud. To have come this far is no small achievement. What you have done is a glorious thing. Even this first step is a long way above the ordinary world. To stand on this step, you must be in your own right a member of the city of ideas. And it is hard, unusual thing to be enrolled as a citizen of that city. Its councils are full of legislators no charlatan can fool. To have come this far is no small achievement. What you have done already is a glorious thing.
Right?
And
Isn't
it's
that
funny
great?
when you know the
I was so
original. I
impressed.
imagine this happens to you if you're reading or speak a translation. In my head, I'm remembering the original and editing it and saying, "Oh, I would translate that
Oh, okay.
differently. I don't think that's the right word." And I feel like I'm almost doing. It almost feels dishonest to be reading somebody else's translation when I feel like I don't agree with that translation of that word
Okay. So you haven't translated
myself.
it
No, I
yourself?
have translated myself some other poems of the same era by different poets. But yeah, oh, there's so many. The Cavafy is just so important that there's
Right.
maybe a dozen published translations of his work. It's just people keep translating the same poets, which is unfortunate. I'm trying to translate women who are alive, because I don't think I wonder which modern Greek writers listeners will know at all, and they're probably all men, and it's unlikely that any of them are still alive. So I'm trying to publish translations of living female writers.
Right. Yeah. Of course, that makes sense, especially when there are so many translations of
Same poems, yeah.
this particular poem
Yeah.
or his work already, right? So why should we waste our time on that? Even if that's not exactly the
Yeah.
way you would like to see it. Thanks for reading that poem.
Thanks for asking.
I thought everybody would enjoy it. So then I'm curious, what other writers from this modern era do you think have influenced you? It's not that I know other writers, but if there are other writers who have kind of shown you a specific path or given you specific insights, any influences like that?
The idea of working with Ithakas was both all of modern Greek writers question the idea of Ithaca in different ways. So I think that others have also asked questions about like the ancient tradition. And then something that comes to mind is another modern Greek writer who I studied in high school, and I'm very grateful to have gone to high school in a place where we studied in great Greek poetry. And this is the first ever Nobel Prize that was awarded to a Greek writer was awarded to George Safaris. And there's a poem we studied that I didn't understand in high school, but I've been thinking a lot lately because it talks about fascism in an implicit way. And I actually don't know what the translation of the title is, so I couldn't pull it up in English. But the Greece had a fascist regime from 1967 to 1974, and um, we read in school a poem from this era, which says, Aspalathi, the name hasn't changed since ancient times. And it refers to a thorny bush that, as the poet says, had the same name in antiquity and now. And he says, I wonder about Plato, who said that tyrants will be tortured in eternity by these thorns, and I'm thinking about them now. And so he's implying that the fascist regime is something that the people of Greece are not able to get rid of and punish right now, but should be tortured in eternity for oppressing the Greek people.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And that's kind of making me think times like that, those hard times, sometimes people say, right, like they are more conducive to those kinds of more
Yes.
metaphorical, more nuanced pieces of writing, right? So sounds like it was one of those
Yes,
pieces,
because what happens when you are not allowed to say what you mean? And
right?
a lot of poets, I mean, Seferis was in Egypt, in exile, in self-imposed exile, along with other members of what would have been the democratic government if the regime hadn't been around. Sorry, I got that mixed up. That was in the 40s, and this was in the 60s. So I'm not a historian. But um, in that period, anybody who spoke out against the fascists would either go to jail, be killed, or exiled, kind of depending on like the people who were very famous got exiled. They weren't killed because there would be an international outcry if they were shot. But normal people were just shot
Right.
for speaking out against the fascist regime. Um, Other people were imprisoned and tortured really, really brutally, as all torture is brutal. And then the most famous people were put either under house arrest or, like, internationally famous, or either put under house arrest or exiled. And actually, the actress who became an activist that I wrote about in This Way Back, she had her Greek
Hmm.
citizenship revoked as punishment for speaking out against the fascists. And I've
Right.
been thinking about that a lot recently with the questions about citizenship and the implication that anyone who speaks in opposition to government policies must not be an American. So,
Yep. Difficult
so
times.
the writers in the era just before I was born had to choose either be exiled and speak out against the regime directly or speak implicitly, right? So the poem that we just talked about said, I'm thinking about the tyrants in Plato's era. That's the poem.
Mm,
And
right.
so if the regime, what I love about this is that it's such a great trap. If the
Mhm.
current regime
Right.
says, hey, you're talking about us, they have to
Right.
incriminate themselves, because they have to say, we think we are fascists and tyrants. But if they don't do that, then what's the problem with this poem? He's just saying that he's thinking about the tyrants from Plato's era. So I love
That's true.
that. And yes, it
That's
forces
smart.
when speaking directly is illegal, there is no way to speak but in
Mhm.
metaphor. And that does require more artistry. But of course, we don't want to have, we'd rather just make art because we like making art. We don't want to have fascism to force us to be artistic and inventive.
Yep, that's true. Okay, now let's steer to a little different direction. So I have a guest who is primarily a non-fictionist, and we don't talk about non-fiction. That won't
Yeah.
be fair, right? So um, your essays in the book don't actually read like memoir. I don't think you'd call them memoir. But when you read the book as a whole, so it has a really good resonance of memoir, especially the last piece you have, right? Um, Moonlight Elegy, the
Thank
way
you.
the epilogue, the way it kind of brings everything together. So that gives that sense that, okay, as a whole, if you look at it, okay, it sounds like a memoir. That's so cool. Then I was really intrigued by that idea because I also, when I teach creative nonfiction as part of this multi-genre creative writing. So I was curious about this. So could you talk briefly about the genre of
Yeah, I'd
CNF
love to.
itself
Yes,
and your
yes,
practice
I'm
within
very
it?
obsessed with genre. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to talk about genre so much. It's something that I actually want to do more of than I have so far kind of published. So I'm grateful to be in this anthology and to keep thinking about this. So my work functions essayistically, I think, primarily, and I always feel good when people say that they read my work as essays, because the primary preoccupation of the work is the idea, is the question, is the philosophical problem, rather than how I came to be who I am today. I think that memoir asks that question. It's a Bildungsroman that really happened. It's a what circumstances form the self. And that is not something that I'm interested in at all. I think of myself as employing
Mhm.
my personal experience as a vehicle for the idea, and the idea, the questions of national identity, the question of labor. I was very preoccupied, I think, in the subtext of This Way Back with the question of how labor, gender, and morality connect. And actually, my second book will be dealing with that
Mhm.
explicitly, while it was more implicit in This Way Back. So, an essay is primarily interested in the arc of thinking, of how do I go from a maybe a simplistic or confounded situation in the beginning, and then I move through the essay towards a maybe a more illuminated, clearer, and more sophisticated and complex understanding of a question. So just as in a short story, a character has to change and develop and have a new relationship with themselves, with the world, with other people, I think that the thinking in the essay develops from simplistic to complex. And when you put all these
Right.
essays together, there is an evolution of myself, and they do sort of have that effect. And I'm delighted to also be able to market the book, say that it's a memoir when I want to sell the book, because I think genre is a way that readers and writers communicate. It's a way, it's a shortcut to connect what one text is doing to what many other texts are doing, because there's a pattern, there's a repetition of structure. So by saying this is an essay, I can tell a reader in one word with the word essay, I can tell the reader what to expect. of their experience, of their relationship with me.
Right.
And by saying the one-word memoir, I can tell the reader that they're going to expect to learn a lot about me as a person and how I developed to become who I am.
Right. Yeah, that's great. So in that essay, the
Yeah,
article I mentioned, I think you addressed
yeah.
that issue of hybridity, right? Uh, I I wouldn't probably say your essays are hybrid in that sense, right? They are just different
Hmm.
genre probably. I don't know. Uh, but I mean, how do you look at this whole idea of hybridity? You seem to be kind of suspicious
Hmm.
of that
Yeah.
notion, right? But I'm thinking of one particular essay at this point. Like I think this is Patricia Hempel's "Red Sky in the
I
Morning."
read it a long time ago.
Right? I mean the idea, if you can recall, she's traveling by a bus, I guess, and then she sees a couple, a young man and a relatively older lady. They happen to be a couple, right, husband wife, and this lady comes to, I mean, gets into the bus and sits next to her, and she just says, "I could tell you stories." So it relates to her relationship with that young man who doesn't look like her husband, actually happens to be her husband. So okay, she says, "I could tell you stories," and she falls asleep. She does not tell that story. And what I'm saying in this case, what I'm remembering is, uh, after that, the essay actually becomes like an essay that she
Yeah.
discusses that idea, the idea of creative nonfiction, right? What makes creative nonfiction, as opposed to fiction or story, right? So in that case, starts as a nice memoir, tells that story, and then halfway through kind of turns
Hmm.
into an essay discussing this whole notion of creative nonfiction. So I was really intrigued by that essay, and sometimes I give that essay to my students and ask, "What do you think of it?" Right? Uh, so again, the notion of rigid genre or the notion of hybridization, right? That's always
Mm,
tricky.
I don't I think the title of the article is Pro Problem of Nonfiction Hybrids, and it's basically I argue that
Okay.
we don't need the term hybrid when we're talking especially about essay,
Okay.
because I don't see why you have to say it's a hybrid of two genres when the essay, like, it's an essay. I get, like, not
Right.
extremely frustrated, but I don't understand when they say it's a combination. This is constant. You constantly hear people say it's a combination of cultural criticism and personal narrative. I'm like, yeah,
Right.
that's the definition of an essay. So people are constantly saying that
Of
it's a
essay.
hybrid or a combination of two things, and what I'm hearing is that's what an essay is. That's an essay. Like, what?
Right. I love that part
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, in your
Thank
article, I think you
you.
talk about Montaigne and all that, right? That's how they define essay and practiced it, and that's
That's
what
what
we are doing in
Montaigne,
this
like,
case,
what
right?
did Montaigne do when he coined the term essay? Obviously, the archetype or the pattern existed before Montaigne. There were things that operated like essays before Montaigne, but Montaigne coined the term. So if we think about the term's coinage and what Montaigne did, what did he do? He used his personal experiences and his personal thoughts as a vehicle, as a means to comment on culture and think about philosophical problems. That's what an essay is. So I'm against the term hybrid because I think it obscures what an essay actually is, and it introduces binaries and divisions where there actually are none. That's how I feel about the term interdisciplinary as well. People are like, "Oh, wow, it's interdisciplinary." I was like, "But wait a minute, you have a piece of paper here." It's like you have a piece of paper and then you rip it up and you make a tear and you're like, "Oh my god, I put them together. Wow." I'm like, there is no division. You invented a division. This is my problem with hybrids and interdisciplinary. It's like you invent a division and then you make a really big deal when you bridge the division that is just in your head. I don't think that these divisions are
Right. Yeah.
legitimate. So I can't embrace the idea of a hybrid between two things that I don't think are separate in the first place. That's how I feel.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. And yeah, that's maybe because we are so obsessed with this whole notion of genre because we need those divisions, those We need compartmentalization to understand things, to practice them for our own ease, probably, right?
Well,
Yeah,
I think fiction versus
definitely.
nonfiction is useful because there's a very important distinction there. But when you're talking about form, and
Right.
I think you think of them as, when we think about them as patterns, then the distinctions are less important. I think that genres are very important. Like, I really like the concept of genre. I just don't think that they're
Mhm.
divided in the way that the concept of a hybrid requires. The concept of a hybrid requires a great distance, but when you're thinking of patterns that are similar and different from each other, like multiple different patterns, then the distinctions are imaginary, is my problem. I have I gave a talk that started genres are not jars, because jars, if you have things in different jars, you like, it's either in this one or this one. But if you have patterns, like for clothing, then you say, okay, this skirt is this shape and this other skirt is, you know, what's a skirt, but when is a skirt a dress? And so these divisions are not as stark as if they were jars.
Right. Yep, that's a good point. Okay, I
Yeah.
think we need to kind of wrap up. Maybe this is my last question, unless you have some other interesting things to share. Maybe you will have, but let me uh, get to this one. So, any specific craft advice maybe you've learned through your own practice, uh, or see from some mentor that has stayed with you and that continues to guide you to guide your practice that you'd
Yeah.
like to share? I mean, there could be many,
Yeah.
right? Oh, of course, we have gone through so much, but
I think knowing which readers you want to trust is something that I had to learn. I think I gave too much authority, kind of going back to our initial discussion of culture and the cultural divides. I think that I gave too much authority to readers who weren't necessarily my readers. And I think the what I learned was to be patient and to seek out a wide variety of readers and learn how to appeal to as many readers as we possibly can. We want to do that. But in this colonial Anglo culture, our first default might be to assume that the hegemonic authority, who is the English only reader who knows like the canon of British and American literature, is an ultimate authority on what I want to do, but they're not invested in what we want to do. If we're trying to open up writing and make English language literature more capacious, then we can't take our only advice from the people who are invested in keeping it the way it is. So I didn't receive this advice, but I figured it out, which is to pay attention to a writer like you, Khem, and a writer who is interested in seeing literature broaden. And so it's counterintuitive. We think we need to learn from the master. It's just like that poem has a younger poet learning from the master, but we have to pay attention to who we want our masters to be. And I think it took me a really long time to recognize that maybe the people in places of authority and with a lot of success in literary affairs in the United States weren't necessarily the masters that I wanted to influence me. I wanted them to be broader. I wanted them to be somebody like you who is maybe at my same level, and but we have the same project. We have a similar project as opposed to the project of keeping English language literature kind of the way it is.
I buy it 100%.
Thank you,
Thank
Khem.
you so much. So thank you again so much, Joanna. It was wonderful speaking with you. To my audiences, thank you again. I see you in my third episode. Bye bye.